this is probably not a good idea. But is it fun? No. Will it make for a good video? Maybe. In my videos, I get lots of questions about using USB for networking or external drives when I talk about NAS devices and things like that. And I thought it would be interesting to take a look at using USB for some of those applications in this video. But I like to be goofy, and so we're going to get pretty goofy. So today, I'm going to be building an all USB NAS, where the boot media, storage, and networking will all be done via USB. So really, other than the CPU and RAM, everything will be over USB. And to do that, I'm going to use the Zima board, just because, as I talked about in my video where I covered it, it's great for slapping together things like this. And not only does it have USB, it has PCIe and SATA, which means we can actually do some A/B tests with the USB versions of networking and storage, and then slot in a networking card and attach our drives via SATA, so we can get sort of an A/B test between USB and better protocols. I'm going to apologize now for how things look and hopefully not how they sound, but yeah, it's these types of videos where I still haven't quite figured everything out and I don't feel like a real YouTuber, but hopefully it'll be fun. It'll definitely be goofy, and maybe we'll even learn something, which is something I like to make sure we do on this channel. And another place you can learn is Skillshare, the sponsor of today's video. Skillshare is an online learning community made up of curious and creative people. Whether you're looking to just brush up on a hobby or take control of your career as a creator, Skillshare can help you accomplish those goals. Fun fact, I just quit my day job. Yeah. Fortunately, Skillshare not only has great courses on creative things like video editing and photography, but also stuff like time management or branding. I just finished up Marques Brownlee's YouTube Success course, and it gave me a lot of great ideas for this channel. But now I'm going through Thomas Frank's Productivity for Creators course, and I'm really curious to see how much more efficient and organized I can be as a creator, which I definitely need. If you want to tackle your career or creative goals, consider joining Skillshare. The first 1,000 people to click the link in the description will get 1 month of Skillshare for free, so go join and start learning today. All right, back to the whole USB thing. Now, are there concerns with using USB for external drives or networking? Absolutely. Now, certain things are going to work better over USB and are going to work better or worse depending on the application or use case. There can be a lot of drawbacks to using USB for things like external drives, for example, and I'll get into that in just a little bit. But at the same time, in the job I just quit, this gets a little bit confusing and off topic, but we actually used USB to network adapters for very mission critical and time sensitive applications. It mostly dealt with audio over IP. And that might seem like not a good idea, but there were use cases where it was actually better to use USB. That gets kind of confusing, but there are definitely drawbacks, and some of them I'm aware of, and some of them I might not be. So I thought it would be fun to throw all this together and sort of see what happens. So what are we going to use? Well, first of all, we're going to use, like I mentioned, the Zima board. And this isn't sponsored or anything. I'm not a shill. I just actually find these useful for little projects like this where I just need to slap some stuff together. So we'll be using that. And then, obviously, some hubs, because we only have 2 ports on here. For the install media, I'm just going to be using a flash drive, and I actually have TrueNAS already installed on this. And you might be thinking, oh my gosh, don't run TrueNAS on this. I know. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this for a long-term NAS. I just wanted to keep things kind of simple, and I originally went with Unraid, but realized that there were going to be some issues with drivers because Unraid doesn't have support for a lot of 2.5 gig USB adapters. So rather than trying to deal with manually installing drivers, I just gave TrueNAS a shot because at least TrueNAS Scale has had good driver support in my experience. So we already have TrueNAS Scale installed on this. We'll be using that as the boot drive. For networking, I have this 2.5 gig adapter from ASUSTore. And actually, ASUSTore sent this over quite a while back, and I was supposed to do a video covering it, and I kind of canned the video. So yeah. ASUSTore, they make USB adapters as well as NASs, and they're pretty good. It works. What else could you want from a USB to 2.5 gig adapter? And this one's actually pretty cool. It's USB-C, but it comes with a little adapter. Now for storage, I have 2 of these 2.5-inch Western Digital 2 terabyte drives. It's a lot of 2s altogether. But yeah, these are just pretty standard 2.5-inch drives, and You'll see why I wanted to use 2.5 drives here in a second, but these work pretty well. I've used them in a couple videos now, and that'll be kind of our main storage. I also grabbed really quickly just I don't even know why I grabbed the Kingston one because that's one of the worst ones I have, but I grabbed a little 128 gig SSD just so we could have another pool that we could maybe push the 2.5 gig networking to its limits a bit more if the hard drives don't cut it. All right, so what are those drives going to go in though? Well, that's where I originally had this fun idea. I'm gonna unplug it so I can grab it. This is from Sabrent, definitely not sponsored. And I kind of knew better than to buy this, but I thought I'd give it a shot. Basically, it's kind of cool. It has 4 slots for drives here. So, you could slot in these drives here. It even has a little magnetic cover that has a fan, although it kind of gets loud and it did cut me. But this could be cool, but I should have just known better before I bought it, because one of the issues with USB enclosures like this is they often will only report a single serial number for the entire enclosure rather than per drive. So when I was sort of testing things out for this video and I hooked this up to TrueNAS, only one drive would show up at a time. I could go into something like LSBLK or list block. I don't even know how you say it. I'm not a Linux guy, not a smart one at least. But then I could see all 3 drives just fine. But when I tried to see them in the TrueNAS UI, only one would show up. And that's because TrueNAS bases things off of serial numbers, which makes sense because if you had one of these drives fail in a pool or in an array, you would want to be able to pull the correct drive. In this case, even if you got something set up, if a drive failed, you couldn't really figure out which one to replace because you wouldn't be able to tell which drive is which. So not a great solution, sadly, because this could kind of be cool. There are some other direct attached storage devices out there that you can get that I believe do report serial numbers correctly, but I haven't really had a chance to mess with any of those. And honestly, they often start to be just as much as a very simple NAS with just as many bays. So it's a little bit hard to justify getting something like that. And if you're going something more high-end that would outperform some of those basic NAS devices, then you should just get a bigger case that can support the drives, and yeah. Anyway, this won't work. So what are we gonna do instead? For the SSD, I just have a simple USB enclosure here that should work just fine. But for the mechanical drives, they're going to need more power. And so I have 2 that I just happen to have of these. I think they're from Orico. Yeah. These are just 3.5-inch drive bays that have USB, but also have 12 volts for power. So we should be able to run our 2 drives, because I'm pretty sure they wouldn't work if we just tried to pull power from these poor little USB ports. So we'll be able to slot our 2.5-inch drives. I know I probably could have gone to larger drives, but I don't really have any that I trust currently. And I think those 2.5-inch drives are going to work a bit better. So we'll put those in here. We'll hook everything up, and we'll see what happens, because that's as far as I got in any of my testing. I kind of made sure that both of these worked, but everything from this point on will just be winging it. So let's get started. All right, first I'm going to just get these drives in. Drive number 1. And there's drive number 2. All right, get this goober out of the way. This is already looking horrible. Oh, geez. All right, so I think I have everything set up over here. I have my SSD. I have the 2 hard drives all hooked up with USB. I grabbed another USB adapter here. I have our boot drive. I have that SSD and networking. And I don't think I'll need a keyboard right now, because I think this should boot up into the correct operating system. Let's find out though. So we'll plug in the Zoom board. I'll let it boot up. All right, we should be getting a feed here. My cable wasn't plugged in all the way. All right, you may be able to see over here, I'm not really sure, but TrueNAS is booting up as expected. So I'm gonna hop over to the desktop and let's see what TrueNAS looks like right now. All right, so I don't have my camera over here, so it's just going to be showing my desktop, but we should be able to sign into TrueNAS. Like I said, I set this up already, at least just the operating system and networking. So really quick, we can go see in networking. We have we have 3 USB interfaces because of the 2 hubs plus the 2 onboard interfaces. And then we have this adapter here, which I just have set up on my 10.0 network, which is my 2.5 gig network. So we're connected. And then if we go to storage, no pools, obviously, but under disks, we should, oh, my bad. I forgot you have to turn these on. We'll give it a second. All right, so you can kind of see on the output of TrueNAS here, it did some stuff when I turned those USB drives on. And then, I didn't even have to refresh. They popped up. We have these 2 drives here, which serials are kind of strange. I'm not sure. This looks like the actual drive serial. This might be a serial coming from the adapter because those 2 Orico adapters are actually slightly different models, but oh well. And then we have our 128 gig drive here. Let's go ahead and set up some pools. So back in storage, I'm going to hit create pool and we'll call this one hard drives. And we'll just select these 2 and we're going to put them into, probably should add them. And they're going to be a mirror and that should be it. We'll hit create, confirm. Okay, and then I'm going to create another pool and we'll call this SSD. And we're just going to add the 128 and it's just going to be striped. It's going to be mad at me, but I'm going to hit force confirm, continue, and create. All right, cool. So we have 2 pools here, one for our hard drives and one for the SSD. I'm going to do some credential stuff really quick and then I'll meet you back. All right, so I created a Haven user really quick. And then let's set up some shares. All right, so under hard drives, I'm gonna go to manage datasets. Oh, I could have just gone to datasets, I guess. It's been a little bit since I messed around in TrueNAS, actually. And we should be able to go up to add dataset, and we'll call it HDD SMB. And we're going to set up share type as SMB and hit save. All right, cool. And then now on shares, I'm gonna hit add for SMB and we'll select the mount as HDD SMB, hit save, enable service. Then I'm gonna edit the file system ACL and we'll add an item for, we can just say group and then Haven and full control. And hit save. All right, and then under drive U, I'm gonna try to mount this. We'll log in with our Haven credentials. And there we go. So if I were to copy a video file over, it works. What is going on here? That's not looking great. It's because my scaling for my monitor. Okay, hey, so we were getting about 149 megabytes per second. That's not too terrible. And I'm gonna try copying it to this folder here. That'll be faster, it's on an SSD. Copy, hit paste, and let's see. Okay, so copying to my desktop, hey. I'm gonna do that again because I wasn't really talking first, but if I copy this video to my desktop, yeah, we're getting like 231. That's not too bad. Really quick, I'm gonna copy the same thing I did with the hard drive pool. I'm gonna do the same thing with the SSD and see if we can't get a little bit faster read speed there. Okay, so I have the exact same setup here, but on the single SSD, and I'm gonna try copying that exact same file over. Okay, we're about limited to, what was that, 270 megabytes per second? I think USB 3 is like 4800 megabit theoretically, so I don't know if we're limited by that or not, but that is interesting. Okay, so this NAS is working. I don't really know how stable it would be, but for right now it's working. We're getting close to the 2.5 gigabit speeds we would expect. But there's more than just raw read and write speed. There's latency, IOPS, things like that. So I'm going to set up iSCSI on TrueNAS. That way I can test using something like Crystal Disk Mark, and then we can start swapping some things out with PCIe or SATA to get a sort of A/B comparison of using USB drives and networking drives and that sort of thing. So I'm going to go get that set up and I'll be right back.
Okay, so I set up iSCSI and have the drive mounted here. It's this iSCSI O drive. Basically, we have a volume on our NAS that is mounted as if it's essentially a drive directly attached to the computer. So because of that, we can run something like Crystal Disk Mark by just selecting the drive and running a test here. Let's go ahead and hit all. I'm gonna let this run.
Okay, so I ran Crystal Disk Mark and we have some numbers, but those numbers aren't super helpful until we have something to compare them to. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to shut this down and I'm going to replace the USB devices we have with things that are better. So for example, I'm going to run the drives off of SATA and I'm going to plug in a 2.5 gigabit NIC into the PCIe slot so that hopefully this works a little bit better. So here goes nothing. Okay, so I'm going to take the drives out of here. We're going to hook those up. Gonna check these bad boys, and then we'll set up the Zima board. And I just realized I'll have to take this plate off of the 2.5 gigabit adapter, because one thing I hate about the Zima board is that the display adapter plug is right where this would go when you plug a PCIe card in. So I'm just gonna take this back plate off. All right. Just some good old Zima board shenanigans here. Okay, so no USB networking and no USB drives. I'm gonna plug this SSD back in just so TrueNAS doesn't freak out on me. I need a keyboard, I imagine. This is so gross. All right, let's plug this guy back in and hope for the best. I'm probably gonna have to reconfigure networking. I'm for sure gonna have to reconfigure networking because that is not going to be configured, which is fine. Okay, so I have Crystal Disk Mark running in the background behind me for the fully non-USB version of our NAS, and it'll be interesting to see how this performs. I'm going to probably off camera just because it's going to take a lot of time, reassemble this and reset back up networking and everything to run this, both with the NIC, but USB hard drives, and then also with hard drives in SATA, like they are, or connected via SATA like they are now, but back to our USB ASIS NIC. So I'm kind of curious to see how all of that plays out. And so we'll have test results from all 4 variations. So I'm going to run all those tests, and then I'll meet you back with the results.
All right, so we have some graphs here. I'm going to break it down for just a second. First of all, we ran Crystal Disk Mark with the 1 GB test 5 times. And here we're looking at sequential read and write bandwidth. So this is all in megabytes per second. And there are 2 different read tests, one with a queue depth of 8 and one with a queue depth of 1. And then same thing for writing sequentially, queue depth of 8 and queue depth of 1. I also ran 5 tests, so at the top you can see the all USB NAS, and I actually did 2 runs because there were some pretty significant outliers that at first I thought might have been bad testing, but after running another test, I think it may just be the nature of using USB. Then below that we have the test with using USB drives, but PCIe for network, and then SATA for the drives, but USB for the network, and then last we have our test setup with no USB at all. So looking here at sequential reads and writes, with a larger queue depth, the read speeds are all somewhat consistent, with 2 of our USB tests actually pulling ahead slightly. But when we go down to a smaller queue depth of 1, the no USB setup sort of takes the lead, although it's still not substantially better than some of the other results. When we get to the writes, though, it gets a little bit messy. The USB network test actually pulled ahead in both write scenarios, but the rest of the USB setups definitely struggled in this regard, especially the all USB setups. We can also take a look at what that looks like in IOPS, or input-output instructions per second, and this relatively mirrors the bandwidth results. When looking at random reads and writes, things definitely get interesting. Once again, with a higher queue depth, most of the read speeds are relatively the same, but when moving to random reads with a small queue depth, both the fully USB tests and the test with USB networking really struggled. And this also went with writes. When using USB networking, and especially while also using USB attached disks, random writes really struggled. Once again, when we look at IOPS, it's pretty much the same story. Things get pretty crazy when looking at latency results, as you can see here, and this is actually why I reran the all USB NAS test. But if we switch from random reads writes to sequential reads writes, you can see that the other test also had a significant outlier, which I don't think is necessarily a result of bad testing, but more so just a result of the nature of using USB for external storage and networking. Rather than looking at the graphs because of the ridiculous scaling, I find that looking at a table like this is more helpful. You can see here that the no USB setup wasn't necessarily the best in terms of latency. However, it was really consistent and didn't have some of the same ridiculous outliers like all of the other setups had. I am a little bit surprised at these results because while the fully non-USB NAS setup performed the best, it wasn't always the obvious winner. I somewhat expected it to completely destroy the other setups. But really, I think the main takeaway here is that not using USB is generally going to give you a much more consistent and stable result, whereas USB could be a bit finicky and have oddities. On a side note, I actually edited this entire video, or at least the majority of it, from this USB NAS. And while I did notice a few hitches here and there, especially when adding footage or saving and loading the project, it wasn't substantially worse or more noticeable than when I'm editing off of my normal NAS. However, that might be due to using low quality proxies when editing.
All right, so as you can see, the results are fairly interesting. It's a bit more mixed than I would have expected. I would have expected the USB stuff to be very consistently worse than the non-USB counterpart, and some of that may come from inconsistencies with testing. Hopefully you can still give an idea of what some of the pitfalls of USB could be. First of all, you have issues like what this Sabrent thing here can do, which is not pass through serial numbers, causing issues for something like TrueNAS. Latency also took a pretty massive hit in some examples when we switched to using USB because there's more overhead there with the USB protocol and all of that processing that has to happen. And honestly, you just end up sometimes with messes like this where it's a bit more crazy than it should be. But hopefully it was still a fun look and maybe we learned something. I don't know. Yeah. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure to hit the subscribe button and, I don't know, check out this video here that I might put up there. That's about it for this one though, so thank you so much for watching. Stay curious, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.